Imagine a United States where a national central government holds almost absolute total power over the states with the authority to veto any state law it decides it wants to, and even send in troops against the states to enforce its will. This was actually the surprising and, to some people, shocking original vision of people like James Madison. Instead of a system of federalism from the so-called father of the Constitution with limited delegated powers as we got under the Constitution, we got something much different. So on this episode, I'll give you the highlights and receipts on James Madison's Virginia plan, which was the primary plan discussed at the Philadelphia Convention, what some people call the Constitutional Convention, in 1787. It was the primary plan discussed during the first anywhere 4 to 8 weeks, depending on how you count it. But first of all, before getting to all that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 29th, 2024. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Let's start out with this article by Kevin Gutzman over at Constituting America. He points out that James Madison spent much of late 1786 and early 1787 at work on what one historian called his research project. Having participated in helping bring about the interstate convention that was going to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787, Madison intended to apply both historical knowledge and practical experience to the task of shaping proposals he would make as a member of Virginia's delegation to the convention. Now, of course, Madison was far from alone in proposing this, but he was the lead guy. He was the one that people considered the most prepared. Virginia was the state that really initiated the call for the convention, not only the Annapolis Convention in 1786, but the convention that became the one in Philadelphia as well. And Kevin said to that end, he drafted a memorandum on the history of federal governments. The result was James Madison's Notes on Ancient and Modern Confederacies, which were prepared kind of starting around the spring of 1786 and then for many months, all the way through June and July, before he ever knew there was going to be a convention in Philadelphia, but maybe he had plans. And here from the National Archives, they say the fundamental lesson that Madison drew from his study was that confederacies were fragile creations, continually tending toward dissolution or impotency. He saw the same fate in store for the American Confederation under the Articles unless drastic corrective surgery were applied. The most common vice of confederacies, the one that, as he put it, seems to have been mortal to the ancient confederacies and to be the disease of the modern, that's how he put it in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, was the absence of a controlling central authority. And we're going to see that throughout James Madison's plan, the Virginia plan, plus what he sees as the vices in the American system under the Articles, that there just wasn't enough centralized power. And centralized power was going to solve all the problems. I guess if that were the case, as a quick aside, we live under the largest government in history. All of our problems would be solved at this point. Anyways, back to National Archives. They say Madison thought he had found the solution to this problem in proposing that a negative or a veto power over local legislation be placed in the hands of the general government. And back to Kevin Gutzman. He said he also gathered his notes on the problems in the American federal system under the Articles of Confederation and put them together in an 11-point memorandum. There was a 12-point, but it was left blank. And that's called The Vices of the Political System of the United States. And this was, depending on the date, he was working on it in April, absolutely. I think he had some handwritten copies. This is a May 7th version from the Library of Congress. And the first thing that he lists is failure of the states to comply with the constitutional requisitions. The failure of the states. So the way that the system was set up, specifically, I'll get to it in a moment, for the requisition system, was Congress said, hey, you guys need to do this, and if the states didn't pony up, then things came up a bit short. Kevin puts it like this. Madison's explanation of this particular vice said that not only had it been suffered by the Confederation throughout its history, but it was endemic to all federal governments. He also called it fatal to the object of the Confederation. And partly on the basis of this claim, some historians have seen the Philadelphia Convention as being spurred chiefly by the desire to secure more reliable funding for the central government. Of course, the taxing system was one of the main things, along with the Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts and regulating commerce among the several states. These were the primary things that we see over and over from the people who were supporting more government power than what was had under the Articles of Confederation. And again, this is a reference to the tax requisition system. I did an episode on this last year, appropriately April 14th, 2023, titled Tax Battle: Patrick Henry versus Alexander Hamilton on the requisition system. And it goes over what it was, how it played out, maybe how some of the Federalists were overblowing the problems with it as Patrick Henry took that side, maybe not. And Patrick Henry was one of the, even on the anti-Federalist side, not too many people were coming out in support of this tax requisition system, which was the Confederation Congress would come up with how much each state had to collect in taxes in order to pay the bills of Congress and of the central government, if you could call it that. And then the states would have their own way to collect the taxes and remit them. It was a requisition system. They couldn't use force to make the states or the people pay up. That was up to each state. Patrick Henry actually said that's kind of a hill he wanted to die on, in essence. And maybe that's a little hyperbole, but Henry was really good at that, and that's my version of it. But he basically said, this is what we have. This is the essence of our political safety, is having this system. Because if they tax too much, well, then we can just say no, and maybe they'll have to think about it. So there was a few people on the anti-federalist side who actually liked this. Most did not. And Madison saw this, of course, being on the big government federalist side at the time, at least. He certainly saw this as a primary issue and listed it first. That episode will be linked to in the show notes. Second up from the National Archives here on the vices, encroachments by the states on the federal authority. So the first thing is failure of states to cough up cash. The second thing is states exercising power that he felt should be left with the general government. He said examples of this are numerous, and repetitions may be foreseen in almost every case where any favorite object of a state shall present a temptation. Among these examples are the wars and treaties of Georgia with the Indians, the unlicensed compacts between Virginia and Maryland and between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And that was their reasoning. Hey, if they're making these deals on trade and things like that, or anything, we should have a uniform version of that run by Congress. That was one of their reasons. And then, of course, the big one, the troops raised and to be kept up by Massachusetts. That's how James Madison put it. Now, that, of course, was a reference to Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts. And I also covered that one in an episode just last month. James Madison, in I think it was 1821, he actually later admitted, even though he put it in the number 2 vice of the entire system, and this was one of the main reasons that people were saying, oh my goodness, if we do not, whether it was John Jay or Henry Knox or George Washington or James Madison and so many others, if we don't have more centralized power to stop this, to stop future ones, the whole world is going to come to when everything's going to be absolute chaos, etc. This was a kind of a really hyped up thing. And James Madison said specifically later on, years later, he admitted that the crisis was very likely overblown by he and others on the Federalist side, saying this: many in the convention then would advocate for what he called, quote, a higher toned system than was perhaps in strictness warranted. That episode, I think, is super interesting. It's based on a really great article by Mike Meharry. It looks like I've got a timeout over at Library of Congress. There's the image. So this is, again, the vices of the political system of the United States. And so a couple of the other ones, for example, again, a lot of the highlights are the problems with the states and the need then, of course, for a stronger central authority to keep those states in check. Vice number 4 was trespasses of the states on the rights of each other. Vice number 7 was reliance on states to implement acts of Congress. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 16 specifically referenced vice number 7 and vice number 1. Basically, the tax requisition system, if you have to rely on the states to implement, and then vice number 7. He didn't call them these vices, But he was complaining about this in Federalist number 16, and he said, if the federal government requires the interposition of the states to implement an act, all they have to do is not act or act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Now, of course, Hamilton is complaining about it, but for our own application today, as a quick aside, the federal government today, according to the National Governors Association, most federal programs are partnerships with the states. And of course, the dirty little secret no one wants us to know is that partnerships don't work when half the team quits. So we can actually take some of this information from the founders, recognizing that when a central or general or federal government relies on state governments to implement their acts, all they have to do is just not act or act evasively, and they can bring it to an end. So that's, I think, a silver lining out of this lesson right here. But anyway, so Madison first started out with this study of confederacies throughout history. This was in 1786 that he went into some detail on this. Then he pointed out what he saw as problems with the current Confederacy, and virtually a vast majority of them led to the notion that the states were the problem and a stronger central government was what was needed in order to solve that problem. So, I mean, this is a very common way that you want to approach things. Well, what has worked and what has failed to work in the past? What is working and failing to work now? And then what is the solution to it? Now, you could also look at it as kind of a Hegelian thing, problem, reaction, solution, but that's a whole different channel than 10th Amendment Center. I'm sure you can find plenty of those elsewhere. But anyways, Kevin Gutzman puts it like this, and this is a great article. It's over 10 years old. Again, it'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in full. He said the next three vices concern the, quote, multiplicity, mutability, and injustice of state laws. Again, at least half, if not more, of the problems in the system. So we shouldn't be surprised as to what he came up with next. That doesn't mean we have to like it, but his proposals were pretty crazy. Here, Kevin writes, Madison developed what eventually would become his immortal Federalist number 10 argument. You should absolutely read that. It's important. That, quote, an extension of the sphere, or linking the end quote, or linking the entire country into one federated republic would, by making it more difficult for a local faction to dominate, make it less likely that oppressive laws would be adopted. So he wanted a large, centralized power to keep everything in check because the problems were factions and people, and the too much democracy was an issue for Madison as well. And Gutzman continues with this. He mentioned that his conclusion was contrary to the prevailing theory. He actually noted this in his vices, that it went counter to what most people held to, and that was Montesquieu's spirit of the laws in 1748, where you, of course, wanted to have a separation of power of the judicial, executive, and the legislative, plus some other stuff. And he said, Kevin said, the Baron de Montesquieu's postulate that Republican government could only survive over the long term if confined to a small area. So that was another argument that Madison and Hamilton took, but this was a direct divergence from the principles that most people held, was that, we're going to be better off with a large republic. Now, whether or not they were correct or not is another story. We're not delving into that today. But Kevin writes, Madison's practical application of his novel idea was that the central government must be strengthened markedly. Very, very much more power is what he wanted. And he started summarizing this in a number of letters. And here from the National Archives, they put it like this. In addition, his letters to Thomas Jefferson on March 19th, 1787, Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia, he ended up being the first AG. He was the one of the lead lawyers that helped draft the necessary and proper clause, for example. Really, really leading legal mind of the time. And George Washington. So March and April, he wrote to Jefferson, Randolph, and Washington, containing the first shoot in his thoughts of a plan of federal government. He looked at the history. He looked at the things that he saw were problems or that he believed were the problems, and then he tried to put it all together into what he thought was the solution. And here's how he put it in that letter to Thomas Jefferson in March. He said, I think myself that it will be expedient in the first place. So the first thing that had to be done is to lay the foundation of the new system in such a ratification by the people themselves of the several states as will render it clearly paramount to their legislative authorities. I think that kind of leads into where Governor Morris came up with "We the People" for the preamble, where Patrick Henry said in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, who authorized them to speak of "we the people" instead of "we the states." Man, I wonder how different things would have been had Patrick Henry not turned down attending the Philadelphia Convention, but, it's super interesting to think about that as well. So the first thing he wanted to do was have ratification by the people, but again, he does say the people of the states. So he's not saying the people as one whole kind of national blob, although he wants to create a national blob, as you'll see here in a moment. Then second, the number two most important thing that has to be done. He said, over and above the positive power of regulating trade and sundry other matters in which uniformity is possible, to arm the federal head with a negative in all cases whatsoever on the local legislatures. So this is how Madison put it to Thomas Jefferson, lead author of the Declaration of Independence and co-author with John Dickinson of the Declaration and Causes and the Necessity of Taking Up Arms the year prior, which explained why they are fighting back. And in that one, in 1775, approved unanimously by the Second Continental Congress on July 6, 1775. They said, why should we even enumerate our injuries in detail? Unlike what they did in the Declaration of Independence, because that was a different reasoning why they were putting that out versus explaining why they were fighting. And they're saying, by one statute, they declare they have power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And if you look at the text up here, and see it on the video. If not, if you're listening on the audio version, whatever you like is great for me. Madison specifically put that in italics. He highlighted in all cases whatsoever. Jefferson, of course, knew what he was talking about. That was the Declaratory Act of 1766. And to claim a power similar to that, or even the same phrase, is kind of a big deal. I wonder what was going on in his head there. But without this defensive power, so he saw it as a defensive power, giving a central government veto power of any law over any law at any level on any issue. The central government would have what he'll call in a letter to Edmund Randolph here in a moment, the kingly authority, basically the power of the King of Great Britain to veto anything on a local basis. He said, without this defensive power, experience and reflection have satisfied me that however ample the federal powers may be made, or however clearly their boundaries may be delineated on paper, they will be easily and continually baffled by the legislative sovereignties of the states. Again, the silver lining for us today is that this was not included, and Madison told us, even here in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he had a very similar take in his letters to Randolph and Washington, which I'll get to in a moment as well, that the states can easily evade federal power and bring them to an end. We should just put that into practice, constantly evade, undermine, refuse to comply, defeat, and nullify. Now, here from an article by Mike Meharry, he said colonial resistance, and again, we're going to talk just briefly about the Declaratory Act, forced the British to repeal the Stamp Act. So there was all kinds of resistance, non-compliance. Even there was a court in Maryland, for example, that said you don't have to comply with this. It's null and void. But at the same time, when they repealed it in early 1766, they passed something called the Declaratory Act, asserting that it could make laws binding the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. And this was cited by pretty much everyone as the root cause of all the other things that they were complaining about in the American Revolution. For example, as I mentioned just briefly, on July 6, 1775, Dickinson and Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. I believe the title is correct there. Passed by the Second Continental Congress, explaining why they were fighting back after Lexington Concord just a couple of months earlier. And they said specifically, we don't even have to list everything. As long as they claim this power over us in all cases whatsoever, we got to take a stand until they stop. Other people mentioned this previously. The First Continental Congress also cited it. John Hancock, Thomas Paine, a bunch of other people. Basically, the idea was for the revolutionaries that all the other problems, taxation without representation, internal taxes, standing armies, etc. These were all versions. These were offshoots of this claim to unlimited power. Because if they could do whatever they want, then even if, and that was Thomas Paine's argument in 1776 in the American Crisis, was even if they can back down on one or two things, as long as they still claim this unlimited power, they're going to use it again in the future. So we have to push on no matter what. And James Madison also mentioned this in his report of 1800 a few years later. He said, the assertion by Great Britain of a power to make laws for the other members of the empire in all cases whatsoever ended in the discovery that she had a right to make laws for them in no cases whatsoever. So even though what Madison is recommending to Thomas Jefferson, a veto power over the states in all cases whatsoever, isn't the same level of power as legislating actively in all cases whatsoever, it really doesn't play out politically in practice much difference. And even if you can make the argument that it does, Madison certainly understood that vast claims to unlimited power in all cases whatsoever could result in having no power at all. Now, all these things that I'm mentioning here, Meharry's article, Kevin Gutzman's great article over at Constituting America, the original source documents that I'm citing, these will all be linked to over in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. My buddy Alan Mosley does an awesome job organizing a blog post for every single episode where you can find not only all the different platforms we're on, of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like X and YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn. We also live stream at rumble.com and odyssey.com, but we have the audio-only podcast edition, so you'll see all that. When you look at any blog post for any episode we've ever done, at the top you'll see all the different platforms along with an audio and a video player. Then if you scroll down a little bit, there's a show links section, so you can say, hey, Bolden, where's that article from Kevin Gutzman? Where are the vices in the American system from Madison? Well, it'll all be linked to there. And I'm doing my best to try to pin that as a comment on some of the platforms as well. But before I get back to it, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat over on Rumble. There's Dennis and Brewster. I wonder if Gypsy is out there as well. Svavek and a few other people. I appreciate you guys being here. Over on Facebook and YouTube and others, there's Howard and Haji and Kirk. Brewster as well, double platforming here. Jug, Chris S., Rights Are Not Tradition, and a number of others. Alan Hughes, I appreciate you guys all being here, whether you, again, it's your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But let's get back to it. Of course, Madison is coming up with his ideas on how to deal with what he saw as the vices in the American system by proposing some new stuff and calling for a negative in all cases whatsoever, plus a number of other things. Of course, you can read that letter to Thomas Jefferson. The letters that he wrote to Randolph and Washington in the following weeks had basically the same plan, little different verbiage from one letter to another. But here he is in a letter to Randolph on April 8th, 1787. Again, he said, let the national government be armed with a positive and complete authority in all cases where uniform measures are necessary, as in trade, etc. Let it also retain the powers which it now possesses. So all cases where uniform measures are necessary. I mean, who makes that decision? If that isn't really close to having power in all cases whatsoever, it's what they determine, basically, what they see as necessary. He said, let it have a negative in all cases whatsoever on the legislative acts of the states, as the King of Great Britain heretofore had. So he's recognizing that this is the type of power that you have in a monarchy. So when the Anti-Federalists were saying, hey, look, we're seeing some people wanting to have a monarchical system, and even if they didn't put that on paper, we think some of them want to push us in that direction anyway. Federal Farmer specifically made that charge about Alexander Hamilton in some of his Anti-Federalist essays. But anyways, he continued to Randolph, let this national supremacy be extended also to the Judiciary Department. And here to George Washington, he said he also talked about the veto power, all cases whatsoever, etc. He said the national supremacy in the executive departments is liable to some difficulty unless the officers administering them could be made appointable by the supreme government. I mean, even if you don't get lost in the weeds of the details here, the terms that he's using, national supremacy, supreme government, this sounds like what they fought to get away from, or very similar, not much different. He said the militia ought certainly to be placed in some form or other under the authority which is entrusted with the general protection and defense. He said a national executive must also be provided. In like manner, The right of coercion should be expressly declared. They want to have the right of the federal government to act coercively, not just on individuals, but on states as well. That is, of course, the latter they certainly dropped from the plan. And he said to give a new system its proper validity and energy, a ratification must be obtained from the people and not merely from the ordinary authority of the legislatures. This will be the more essential as inroads on the existing constitutions of the states will be unavoidable. He knew that in order to be able to set up this type of system, that they were going to have to kind of make inroads on what the states had previously reserved to themselves. So maybe he was recognizing there was going to be a fight on this. Now, as I covered in some detail in another recent episode, it was, and I mentioned this at the beginning, it was Virginia who initiated the call for the Philadelphia Convention. This was in late 1786. And so the delegates that were there in Philadelphia from Virginia and the other states, they were kind of expecting Virginia to come up with the first proposal of what to do. Hey, you guys, got the ball rolling. You called for this thing. You called back in January of 1786 for the Annapolis Convention, which put out this resolution that asked the states that were there to call on the other states to come up with a plan that led to Virginia initiating the call. Anyways, I covered all that in detail with receipts in another episode just very recently earlier this month, July 19th. So they basically are expecting this to happen. So Edmund Randolph, governor of Virginia, said pretty much that at the beginning of the convention without objection. Hey, this is what we're doing. And this is what we call today the Virginia Plan. While most people cite Madison as the primary or only author, he certainly worked on it with a bunch of other people from Virginia. Edmund Randolph, George Wythe, who wasn't there the whole time. George Mason, I'm not sure what Mason's involvement or whether he was opposed to some stuff, because as I did cover on Friday's episode, Mason's objections to the Constitution, and George Washington. So it was George, Edmund, and James. Now, here from National Archives, these letters to Jefferson, Randolph, and Washington were the basis of these resolutions submitted by Governor Randolph to the convention in Philadelphia on May 29, 1787. It became known in history as the Virginia Plan. The first thing that they wanted, one, resolved that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. Benjamin Franklin had the first draft of an Articles of Confederation submitted to the Continental Congress in sometime in mid to late July of 1775, almost a year before the Declaration of Independence, about the same before John Dickinson and others started working on what became the Articles of Confederation. And he had a similar phrase in there about general welfare. He handed it out to people. Thomas Jefferson made some notes on it. They actually have the original annotated copy from Jefferson, and he basically said, hey, general welfare? We shouldn't have terms so vague as this in a document so important. So he didn't like that type of thing, at least at first. Later on, I did not see any commentary about that from him during his back and forth letters about the Constitution for the United States. But anyways, so that was the first thing. We want to enlarge the power. And then also from the plan, they wanted two branches of a national legislature, with the first elected by the people. But what ended up becoming the Senate was originally in Madison and Randolph and Washington and Mason and Wythe's plan, this Virginia plan. The second branch was going to be elected by the first branch. So the House of Representatives, they didn't call it that. The first branch would elect the second branch out of people that were nominated by the state legislature. So that's kind of an interesting twist. He wanted a national executive, a national judiciary. They came up with, they said there should be a plan for admitting new states, which, of course, the Confederation Congress under the Northwest Ordinance also passed in July of 1787. He wanted national legislation over virtually everything, a veto power over state laws, and the ability to use the militia and military against any state that doesn't comply. Pretty crazy stuff. Here from resolution number 6, the national legislature ought to be empowered to enjoy the legislative rights vested in Congress by the Confederation, and moreover to legislate in all cases to which the separate states are incompetent, or in which the harmony of the United States may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. I mean, it doesn't specifically say that we're going to legislate in the states as well in all cases whatsoever, but that's as close as you could get, I think, at least in my opinion, by not including that specific phrase. But then he does include it here. To negative all laws passed by the several states contravening, in the opinion of the national legislature, the Articles of Union or any treaty subsisting under the law, the authority of the Union, and to call forth the force of the Union against any member of the Union failing to fulfill its duty under the articles thereof. So total national legislative power in basically every situation, a veto over anything on a state or a local level. The most minute thing would be a federal issue or a central national issue. In their opinion, if they think it should be vetoed, there were no limits. It was up to them. And then, of course, the power to call forth the military force to get the states to comply. Here from Rob Natelson, he said, in effect, the Virginia Plan was a scheme in which the states would survive only as corporations, fulfilling the kind of subordinate roles that local government played in England. One delegate, Delaware's George Reed, proposed abolishing the states entirely. So did Hamilton. He just, by, I think it was June 18th or so, within the first couple of months, he basically had this long proposal that said, we should get rid of the states if we can. And if we can't, let's do what we can to make them kind of diminished. So Delaware's George Reed proposed abolishing the states entirely. Most of the delegates believed, however, that the states should be preserved, if merely for instrumental reasons. I think that was Madison's view, especially at the beginning of the convention. We can't get rid of them. That would not be expedient. It would be very difficult. So let's keep them in there, but render them kind of impotent. The general government, Rob writes, simply could not, quote, extend its care to every requisite object over such a large territory. That was some opposition. And the plan was, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the primary basis of discussion for maybe the first 6+ weeks, if not 8. Some people report it differently. But on June 17th, Roger Sherman kind of turned things around a little bit, began to turn the tide. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed that the states retain exclusive jurisdiction over such matters, the internal police, basically the police power. Governor Morris responded that in some cases, they ought not even have that. So the high nationalists, the people who wanted a really higher tone system, Morris, Wilson, Hamilton, Madison specifically right at the beginning, they didn't want the states to really have anything other than kind of a ceremonial part to play in this. But Roger Sherman, Rob writes, introduced his proposal in the form of a motion to enumerate the powers of the central government with a proviso that the states should be able to legislate, quote, when the general welfare of the United States is not concerned. Now, that isn't a super limiting approach, but it was flipping the script. Instead of saying it was up to the general government to have legislation whenever they want, then the states should actually be able to legislate in more areas. At least that was kind of the way that they were thinking on this. The convention did reject it right off the bat, instead adopting a resolution allowing Congress, quote, to legislate in all cases for the general interests of the Union, and also in those to which the states are separately incompetent, or in which the harmony of the United States may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. Now, I know this is not what they ended up by September 17th, 1787, but here we are in June and July of 1787, and there's still, I think I may have said June. July 17th, that was Roger Sherman's motion, not in June. So this is a couple of months in, basically, and they're still proposing this kind of unlimited centralized power. There was a strong push for that at the Philadelphia Convention. But that was really the beginning of the end for the Virginia Plan. And by the time there was a committee report out, I think it was August 1st, the language of the Virginia Plan was almost completely gone. And at least there was a modest enumeration of delegated powers, which replaced it. Now, meanwhile, here on June 20th, 1787, James Madison got a letter back from Thomas Jefferson regarding his plan to have things a veto power in all cases whatsoever. And Jefferson was not a fan. Surprise, surprise. He said the negative proposed to be given them on all the acts of the several legislatures is now for the first time suggested to my mind. It hadn't even crossed his mind that such a thing would be appropriate. He said, prima facie, I do not like it. So just immediate thought, my gut instinct, this is not cool. He said it fails in an essential character, that the whole and the patch should be commensurate. But this proposes to mend a small hole by covering the whole garment. So he's saying, okay, yeah, maybe you can come up with some scenarios where it would be a good idea to have a general government have this power over the states. But it's so rare in comparison to almost everything they do. And so that what you're doing is you're proposing this massive power to deal with a tiny issue. And that's how he put it. Not more than 1 out of 100 state acts concern the Confederacy. This proposition, then, in order to give them 1 degree of power, which they ought to have, gives them 99 more, which they ought not to have, upon a presumption that they will not exercise the other 99. So Jefferson, no fan of Madison's approach to have a veto power over the states in all cases whatsoever. Now, just about 2 weeks before the end of the Philadelphia Convention, this is early September 1787, Madison is kind of there, not totally secret, because he is writing to Jefferson here. So he confided in a letter on September 6th to Thomas Jefferson his opinion that the Constitution would fail because it didn't have this veto power over the states. It did not have enough strong centralized power. And here's how he put it. I hazard an opinion, nevertheless, that the plan, should it be adopted, will neither effectually answer its national object, nor prevent the local mischiefs which everywhere excites disgust against the state governments. So he is very concerned about basically a decentralized system where things are very different from state to state. And he thinks that's a real problem. Jefferson wrote back. Oh, here he is again. This is Madison. He followed up. So he said, hey, there's some problems here. I think it's not going to work. It's going to create all kinds of problems. And then after the Philadelphia Convention, he wrote like 12 to 15-page letter explaining this in detail. And that's how the National Archives put it. October 24th, 1787, the letter printed below, running to 17 manuscript pages, contains Madison's detailed explanation of that opinion, and reveals that the man who later became an indefatigable publicist in support of the new Constitution was in fact profoundly disappointed with the results of the convention. Now, that is their take on it. I think it's actually a pretty good one. National Archives doesn't always get this stuff right, but he certainly was unhappy. He really thought they needed far more power, and he doubled down on this despite Jefferson his response, despite the fact that they came to various compromises during the Philadelphia Convention, despite the fact that he defended it as strongly as he could, even in areas where he didn't agree with it. So Madison doubted, which I guess is something to be said for his honesty on these things, or his trustworthiness. Madison doubted the workability of the plan agreed upon at Philadelphia because it lacked the one ingredient that in his view was essential for establishing the supremacy of the central government and for protecting the private rights of individuals, a power vested in the national legislature to negative or veto state laws. So he really kept hammering home that he really thought this needed to happen, and he was unhappy about it. Here's Jefferson writing back in December of 1787. And his summary, he didn't really go much further because he already explained. And then he went into some detail about the things that he liked about the proposed Constitution there in December of 1787, and some of the things that he didn't like a lack of a Bill of Rights, for example. But when it comes to a national veto power, he was not a fan because, of course, this meant centralized authority. And as he explained previously over the summer, this meant you're giving them power to do 100 things when they really only need it in one situation. And then you have to trust them to do the right thing in 99% of the time. And anyone who trusts government to do the right thing 99% of the time is going to be very, very disappointed. He said, I am not a friend to a very energetic government. It is always oppressive. Not sometimes, not most of the time, not once in a while, and not just over there in Paris where he was, But every form of government ever known to man, according to Thomas Jefferson, if they're energetic, so lots of strong centralized power, it is always oppressive. Then he discusses the rebellion in Massachusetts. The late rebellion in Massachusetts has given more alarm than I think it should have done. Calculate that one rebellion in 13 states in the course of 11 years is but one for each state in a century and a half. No country should be so long without one, nor will any degree of power in the hands of government prevent insurrections. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. We work hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people with this essential foundational information from the founders, the stuff that they just don't teach us in government-run schools. They don't want us to have a complete picture of how things were, the reasoning behind what the founders had to say. If anything, they just want to teach us dates and, well, every problem has a government solution. That's what I learned in government-run school. So we work hard, super hard every day to reach and teach more and more people with this kind of info. Of course, this show, this podcast, these videos, but we also have over 10,000 articles and blogs over on our website, over at 10thamendmentcenter.com. And if you want to help us do this work, nothing helps us more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options, and I would be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. You can also make a one-time contribution over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate, or free and easy peasy. Smash that like button, subscribe, get notifications, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts, comments, especially in the archive. All those things can trigger those mainstream platforms, their algorithms, and tell them to show us to more people. And your help has been awesome on every account, whether it's helping us spread the word, helping us financially, or just being a part of this with us. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty.